Let's move now to demonstrate this process of deriving theological themes. And our attention will be given to the letter of 2 John. Very simple letter that reads as follows. The elder, to the chosen lady and her children, whom I love in the truth, and not I only, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth which lives in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, will be with us in truth and love. It has given me great joy to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as the Father commanded us. And now, dear lady, I am not writing you a new command, but one we have had from the beginning. I ask that we love one another, and this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commands. As you have heard from the beginning, his command is that you walk in love. Many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch out that you do not lose what you have worked for, but that you may be rewarded fully. Anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Christ and does not have God. Whoever continues in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not take him into your house or welcome him. Anyone who welcomes him shares in his wicked work. I have much to write to you, but I do not want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk with you face to face, so that our joy may be complete. The children of your chosen sister send their greetings. In developing an outline or a structure for 2 John, we could begin by putting the first 4 verses together under the heading of greetings. From there we could move on to verses 5 through 6, where the focus is on love, and designate this section command to love. Then we could pick up on verses 7 through 11 and designate this section warnings regarding the Antichrist, as John takes the trouble here to define and warn the people about the Antichrist. And then finally we could have a look at verses 12 and 13, which could be closing greetings, or as I've designated, salutation. Based on this, we have a simple structure in which greetings covers the first 4 verses, command to love verses 5 and 6, warnings regarding the Antichrist verses 7 through 11, and the salutation the remaining 2 verses. However, it's important to understand that basic structures are not built into the biblical text, and that structures or outlines that we may derive are there to help us to interpret and to understand the text as we have it. To illustrate this, here's a second example of a basic structure. In this example, the person has put the first 3 verses together, then verses 4 through 11 with 3 subheadings, and verses 12 and 13. A third structure emphasizes verses 1 through 6 and then verse 7 through 13. In this case, the first section is entitled Path of Truth, Love, and the second part, Peril of Truth, Laxity. Now, just a comment about those 2 main headings. You'll notice that they look neat and tidy, with the P, Path of Truth, and the P, Peril of Truth, and under the Path of Truth, the L for Love, and under the Peril of Truth, the L for Laxity. One thing to take note of is that when outlines are constructed in this way, that there is always a greater danger that we begin to manipulate the content to fit into a structure, and especially the headings that we want to create. Whenever you see outlines like this, it doesn't mean that they are bad, but it does mean that one needs to exercise a little more caution in their use. We see this again in the final structure. The first section is entitled Abide in, whereas the second one starts Abide not. First one continues in God's commandments, and the second one with false teachers. Again, the focus is in the first 6 verses, and then the final 7 verses, together with certain subheadings. You can compare these 4 basic structures. What you will see are certain commonalities. Obviously, they're all based on the same book, but certain subtle differences. Generally speaking, those differences do not give cause for concern. However, there are times when the outline or structure derived is also trying to make a point. Keep an eye open for that. Now, when we look at theological themes, as we said before, the first step is to identify the key concepts and words. As I've had a look at this letter, I would suggest that the first key concept or word relates to the idea of love. And so what I've done here is I've used red to highlight the word love wherever it is found through the letter. Find in verse 1, 3, 5, and 6. Next word I identified was truth, which appears rarely in the first third of the letter and appears on 5 occasions. One question that you would need to ask is, does the fact that the word or the concept the fact that it does not appear in the entire letter, does that reduce its significance? Together with this, the important question of simply because something appears regularly does not automatically make it a key concept or word. However, at this stage, we're doing a little bit of a brainstorm, and those concerns are not yet important. Furthermore, I identified the word teaching in verses 9 and 10 as a possible key word or concept. I picked up on the deceiver Antichrist in verse 7. And here's a good example. It appears only 3 times in one verse. The question we will need to ask is it key? Is it important? And then finally, I used a category which I've just called anything else, in which I've picked up on a couple of other things that may be important in this letter. I've spoken about the idea of having gone out into the world, that the people needed to watch out that they didn't lose what they had worked for, that the Antichrist was not to be taken into people's homes and welcome them, because if that happened, they would be sharing in his wicked work. Now, just to comment on the idea of not taking someone into your home, you may or may not be aware that hospitality was a very high value in the first century world of Jesus and the early church. So when John says that the people are not to show hospitality, immediately one must identify that as quite significant. The second thing we need to do then, second step, is to check the significance. Having a look at the letter as a whole, the question that you're going to ask yourself is, if I remove that concept or word, would it impact significantly on the letter? So let's have a look at the word love. Right up front, John uses the word love as an aspect of the relationship that he has with the chosen lady and her children. A little later, he speaks about God being with us as himself and the people he's writing to in truth and love. He emphasizes in verse 5, he says, I ask that we love one another, and then he gives a definition of love, and he speaks about the command that we are to walk in love. I would suggest that love is significant. You may want to look at the other key words and decide for yourself. Following on from that is the third step, the concise theological themes. As you can see, I've accepted that all 5, the things that I identified, are probably significant. And at the bottom of the page, you can read the 5 themes in their concise statement. Firstly, the call to love, toward one another in obedience to the Father. Second, the significance of truth for and in Christian living. Third, the identity and danger of deceivers and antichrists. Fourth, the importance of correct teaching regarding Jesus Christ. And finally, the danger of welcoming the deceiver and antichrist. Let me highlight using the first one as an example. Looking at the first one, the temptation may often be simply to list as one of the theological themes of 2 John, love. And certainly love is a theme of the Scriptures. Love is something we find in many books and letters in the Bible. However, as I indicated before, this concise statement must emphasize something of what we find in the letter. What is John's particular nuance or emphasis in this letter? And that is why I've written that the theme here is the call to love, toward one another, and in obedience to the Father. Now when you read that, you have a far better sense of the theme as developed, as found in 2 John. So, for example, you can go down to the 5th point. The danger of welcoming the deceiver and Antichrist. It's not a general statement. It's a much tighter statement about hospitality. It is well possible that in another book or letter in the Scriptures we might speak about hospitality in a very different way. However, the danger of welcoming the deceiver and Antichrist is the point, is the theme of John in this letter. Finally, steps 4 and 5. Step 4, a brief description of the themes, and step 5, the insertion and addition of biblical references. Look at the example at the bottom of the sheet, related to theme 3, the identity and danger of deceivers and antichrists. Leaving out the biblical references for a moment, I've developed a description of the theme as follows. Those who deny the incarnation of Christ are deceivers and the Antichrist, being opposed to Jesus. They are a danger to Christ followers because their denial results in the destruction of any relationship with God and threatens the reward of the Christ follower. As a result, they are not to be shown hospitality under any circumstances. That is my brief description, my 1 paragraph, number of lines description. However, the final step is the insertion of the biblical references. And again, may I remind you that what we're wanting to deal with here is the person who wants you to show them where you got it from. So, starting out, those who deny the incarnation of Christ, if you have a look back into verse 7, you will see that John says, many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. In other words, what John is saying is, these deceivers deny that Jesus came in the flesh. In other words, they deny the incarnation of Christ. So following that statement, I've inserted that reference, 7a. Are deceivers in the Antichrist, drawn out of verse 7, being opposed to Jesus, drawn again out of verse 7. They are a danger to Christ followers because their denial results in the destruction of any relationship with God. Where did I get that from? Well, have a look at the beginning of verse 9. Anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Christ, in other words, the right teaching, does not have God. That appears to threaten the relationship we may have with God. And if you go back to verse 8, it says, watch out that you do not lose what you have worked for, threatening the reward of the Christ follower. And then finally in verses 10 and 11, John makes it very clear that these deceivers and antichrists are not to be shown hospitality under any circumstances. What I have done by inserting those biblical references is providing the textual basis for the way in which I have developed that theological theme. Having learnt this, you may now want to move on to practice this process of deriving theological themes. I would suggest that you look at a book like Jude. Another alternative may well be Philemon, as you want to practice this. I trust it goes well and that you will learn much. Thank you.